This is the $130 to $160 HYTE X50 case. It's very bubbly design, and they have a unique set of louvered vents on the back, which should, in theory, evict the air a little bit faster, a little straighter path out of the case, at least according to what HYTE is claiming. And this was an engineering challenge for them to stamp and retain the steel and then bend it slightly. So we've set up this testing setup to validate their claims, where we have a different X50, we have a parabolic lens for Schlieren imaging, and then over here, the Schlieren photography is being taken by this camera with this pin light source. We're doing some lighting tricks where we are shooting the pin light at the lens, the mirror, bouncing it back at the lens of the camera. We are cutting it with a razor. This allows us to see the air density gradient and see how the louvered vents actually impact it versus the claims that HYTE is making. So rather than using smoke flow testing with its many inaccuracies and limitations, such as the fog density just being heavier, we can instead look at the refractive index changes caused by air density gradients that distort parallel light beams. HYTE is also making some interesting acoustic claims with its side panels, including the glass panels, and we can actually scientifically validate this. So in the chamber, we will today be testing I need to stop shouting so much. Today, this is a quiet space. Today we're going to be testing the unlaminated glass panel versus the laminated glass panel. HYTE calls these acoustic glass panels, which is a marketing retrofit for a laminated glass panel. And we're going to see if it actually has any impact on acoustics in the acoustic chamber. We can actually commence the test right now. Do you hear any difference, Andrew? Damn. I worked really hard on this. We produced some frequency spectrum plots today in the acoustic chamber that'll talk about the differences in the glass panels. They only ship with the laminated one, but we got one of each. And then for the other model of the case, it comes with two mesh panels instead. So mechanically, the case is unique, and we do think that they executed on really good build quality. I mean, the build quality overall is excellent. It came together well. It's pretty sturdy structure for the case. The X50 uses a continuous panel that wraps around the side. So that is both the mesh version and the glass version here. And then on the other side of the case, the back side of the case, there is a mesh panel for both models of it with, it still wraps, but not as much. It's a unique approach though. They've basically eliminated a top panel as a result. Now the front of the case is the most unique part. The front is a mesh panel that has edge-wrapped perforations for cooling. Pricing with tariffs in the US is $160 for the X50 with glass and $130 for the X50 Air with a mesh side panel. Worldwide pricing is $10 cheaper for each. Neither case comes with fans, but they do sell color matched ones. Finally, at least for the review samples, HYTE sent us incredibly, unbelievably bad smelling candles. So Rob, you can just keep those next time. Thanks. All right, let's get into the review of everything except for the candle smell. That's more of a Yeston thing. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new Duronaut thermal paste. Thermal Grizzly claims its Duronaut paste is intended for long-term stability and endurance, focusing on paste longevity in addition to the usual performance focus. Thermal Grizzly's Duronaut paste comes with applicators and spreaders, and ships in numerous tube sizes, aiming to provide a high-end paste for PC builds and daily driven overclocks by enthusiasts. Learn more at the link in the description below. The rounded curves of the X50 are its most prominent feature. We talked about this when we covered the case at Computex earlier this year, where getting the mesh all the way around the edges, the borders, while also kind of doing that edge wrap without having a hard point somewhere, an angle or an edge, that is what HYTE said was challenging. And we showed at that time some of their other options for this, where basically it was they could do it in plastic, no problem, but they weren't happy with anything about that, mostly the quality, or they could do it in a different lower porosity steel that just wouldn't be as good for airflow. Eventually the factory was able to figure this out. We talked about that in that video, but this is probably the most promising aspect for the airflow on this case and what we think gives it some hope to challenge something like the new BF360 Flow, which is a highly airflow focused case we just reviewed. Even as it is, some of the other complex pieces are plastic. So it mostly shows up in the bottom of the case where they've angled it around the edges to create that sort of cowling around the bottom intake fans. One thing we noticed though was that the color matching is impressively good on the purple model we have here when you look at things like the plastics and the metal and the grommets. We also have shots of some of the other colors like glossy red, green, and pink from the Computex showing. HYTE's been experimenting with non-black and white colors for a few case iterations now. The HYTE X50 supports up to 3 140mm front-mounted fans and has side and bottom support for 3 120mm fans each. The case also fits one rear 120mm fan, so overall fan sizes are relatively limited, mostly to 120s. The front mount has 425mm of clearance from top to bottom, so typical 360mm radiators will fit and 420s will not. Radiators up to 105mm thick on the front, which is comically thick, and 70mm on the side are officially supported, but not simultaneously, obviously. Assuming 25mm thick fans, you have about 25mm of radiator space on the side and about 35mm on the front before the two conflict with each other. Because the power supply is in the once traditional top-mounted position, its fan also acts as exhaust. What's old is new again. Power supplies are tested in ambient temperatures of 40 to 50 degrees Celsius, so they can handle the internal ambient heat better than most components. The front fan mount is the only one that's removable. It can be adjusted out in increments of 10mm, starting from either 0 or 15, depending on which way the mounting hardware is flipped. The maximum 45mm offset shown in the manual doesn't actually fit with the front panel. Fortunately, we don't really think that'll affect compatibility for anyone. Pushing the bracket back to 0mm means that it's flush with the front of the metal chassis. In other cases, we found that this can help with thermals, but setting a 0mm offset makes it much harder to reach the cutouts for fan cables on the front of the case. The X50 Air replaces the laminated tempered glass panel with a cheaper mesh panel, but that panel doesn't include any side mounts, like the Fractal North's side fan mount bracket, for example. Downdraft CPU coolers and some GPU configurations, depending on sort of the pressure system that develops in the case, or if it's vertically mounted, could benefit from the mesh panel just passively. Claimed motherboard support goes up to 10.6 inches for so-called eATX, but standard 9.6-inch ATX boards line up precisely with the edge of the motherboard tray and look much neater. Mechanically, the case is mostly a standard box, but refined in some ways. The side panels slide down onto the case and pop into position, with the larger panel that wraps over the top assisted by magnets. The magnets lead to some flexing of the Air's mesh, but the panel is supported on all edges by the shape of the chassis. The X50's panels need to be pressed against the chassis at the same time as they're being pressed down, or they won't land flush, which the manual does highlight. As we frequently point out, there's no way to screw down the panels for shipping, although the way these panels are attached makes it basically impossible for them to ever come off with the case standing vertically, since they do wrap around the top. The power supply shroud is a solid piece of steel and is fully enclosed, except for the bottom interior. This will help with CPU tower cooler exhaust, but we'd like to have seen an option that could flip it to take advantage of the top ventilated panel as well. Maybe this was a choice to ensure users of the glass panel don't accidentally orient the power supply in the wrong way, or maybe it was for cost control, or because then you'd have to figure out what to do with the hole in the bottom of it. But either way, the power supply can only pull from internally. Fortunately, they can handle warmed air better than most parts, so that's fine. Front to back, the shroud has 270mm of space, including cables, with an advertised 223mm maximum power supply length. Good attention to detail here means that there's an included Velcro tie-down inside the power supply shroud, although less good attention to detail means it's difficult to get access to it once the power supply is actually installed. The X50 is nearly as wide as the original dual-chamber O11D at 25.5cm versus 27cm, which leaves about 5.5cm between the motherboard tray and the side of the case for cable management. Typical mid-towers have around 2 to 3cm of cable management clearance. The hidden paths for fan cables are excellent. The bottom, front, and side mounts each have entrances into the molded plastic channels at the top and bottom of the case, although you may need to use some extensions if you want to route everything exclusively through those paths. The tie points around the edge of the motherboard tray aren't fancy, but they're effective in combination with the included Velcro ties. Alternatively, some of the ties can be moved to the back of the case for bundling power and I/O cables, a feature that Fractal has been pushing for a few years now. Continuing on cable management, HYTE says the silicone cable grommets are the single most expensive piece of the X50 by volume. These are giant, molded pieces in the style of the Y70. Grommets aren't included with the less expensive Air SKU, with the justification that they can't be seen through the side panel anyway. HYTE also has a number of areas of smaller attention to detail in the case. The power button, for example, uses what appears to be a GTMX low-profile switch. or basically similar to a Cherry MX Blue keyboard switch. Using a keyboard switch here is 100% on brand for HYTE, as is the fact that it requires 4 LEDs just to illuminate the circular white power button. The only downside is that the tactile click doesn't line up with actuation, so you can click the button without actually turning your PC on. The paw and contemporary foot styles are also unique. These are locked to specific colorways, so-called paws come with purple, pink, and green cases for feet, and contemporary feet come with white, black, and red cases. These aren't available as standalone accessories. The X50's elaborate, rounded drive cage supports 2 2.5-inch drives and 1 3.5-inch drive simultaneously. The fact that the X50 can fit 2 2.5-inch drives and a full-sized hard drive all stacked on top of each other behind the motherboard tray is a testament to the unusually large cable management area and the extra width of the case. Unfortunately, all 3 drives have to be installed with plugs facing the rear of the case, so there's no tidy cable path from the power supply to the drive cage. On packaging, there's some cognitive dissonance with the environmental friendliness. We made a point of praising Haven and the BF360 for shipping screws in reusable labeled bags. HYTE also does this, except HYTE's reusable bags contain smaller, not reusable, disposable single-use plastic bags, which is just totally unnecessary. It's kind of like when the motherboard companies put a single M.2 screw in a gigantic single-use plastic bag. So getting to the thermal testing, this is always a challenge with cases that don't include fans because we have to just pick something. And the difficulty with that is when it comes with the fans out of the box, you're testing it as it is. In most scenarios. Some people, yes, we know, some people swap the fans, but on something like a BF360, it's very easy, because if you swap the fans out of that case, you are a lunatic, because that's what you're paying for. And so removing them and putting something else in, on that case, almost nobody sane will do that. You would just buy the fanless one instead. That would make a lot more sense. This doesn't come with fans. We had to pick some. We picked the Antec Flux Non-Pro. So the Flux Non-Pro comes with 5 fans. It is a competitive case in terms of pricing, sort of, but it does come in a little bit cheaper once you factor in the cost of the fans for something like this. We do, however, think that it's a great comparison. We're now on the charts. We can directly compare the HYTE X50 to the Antec Flux Non-Pro, which is a kind of moderately performing case. And so looking at those two on the same chart with the same fans, if a difference is established between them, what that tells us is it comes down to things like this: the panel design, the case design, the distance from the fans to the cooler, things of that nature. We also did testing with our standardized fans, which we do on pretty much every case we review, where we take all the fans out of them, even if it doesn't make sense, and then we put standard ones in instead. That allows us to check how the case performs strictly from the structure standpoint and the paneling, not from the fans that are included or not included. So the Flux Non-Pro is a much cheaper case. It comes with 4 120mm fans though and 1 140, which all fit simultaneously into the X50. We placed the single 140, which was the odd man out, in the front top slot as intake for the CPU cooler, and then 2 120mm fans as intake in the other 2 front slots, another 120mm fan as intake in the side bottom slot, and the single reverse blade 120 as rear exhaust. The bottom slots were left empty for this testing. Each configuration of testing for a case for our process, which is very rigorous, can take several days per configuration, so we have to kind of pick things that we can isolate, can't go too crazy with too many configs, and so we've picked a couple that we think are pretty good representations for purposes of what we're doing, which is relative comparisons versus competition. The Haven BF360 is a head-to-head competitor for the X50 in some ways. It doesn't necessarily look like it. They look very different, but they are both thermally targeted. They both advertise being excellent for airflow, and maybe after that is followed the Antec C8 Curve. We have test results for the C8 ARGB, which includes fans. Now, of the cases that HYTE chose to compare the X50 against in reviewer materials, we agree mostly with the Fractal Torrent and the North XL. They also list the NZXT H7 Flow 2024, but we don't have test data for that one. All right, let's get into the thermal testing and the acoustics. HYTE was making kind of a big deal about its so-called acoustic glass, and so to start, we did some tests in the hemi-anechoic chamber with our microphone positioned 1 meter away from the case. An important note on this: our standardized acoustic testing for noise normalization measures straight on at the front panel, which we did take for our noise-normalized process, and for which the X50 ran at around 44 to 45 dBA under those conditions. You'll see those in a minute. But for the panel comparisons we're doing, we're instead shooting straight on at the side panels instead of at the mesh front panel. since the glass on the side won't affect front-facing noise other than actually just emitting more of it than the mesh panel because it has nowhere else to go. So, for the frequency spectrum comparison pointed at the side of the case, the laminated acoustic panel is nearly identical to the unlaminated panel. On a technicality, the laminated panel shifts some of its peaks slightly left on the frequency plot, such as at about 220 to 230 Hz, at about 500 Hz or so, and about 900 Hz. They spike at the same points, but the laminated panel is just very slightly lower frequency. It's hardly measurable, although it is measurable, and it's difficult to know if this is variance or not. We don't think it's variance, but it's also not relevant even if it isn't. The noise levels are the same. The laminated panel measured at 40.2 dBA, and the unlaminated panel measured at 40.3 dBA under these exact test conditions. Now, there's a million ways you could test this. Maybe there's a scenario where HYTE can see a difference, but for a normal computer scenario, we can't find one. 0.1 dBA is absolutely within variance and error, and so these are effectively identical. Maybe if you put a noise-generating speaker in the case, you can find ranges where it's different, but what people will put in the case is a computer, and we couldn't find the difference. Adding the mesh panel version to the charts, we see 40.5 dBA as the result, so only slightly higher. The frequency shifts substantially though, despite only a 0.2 dBA increase in dBA SPL. The mesh panel has louder high frequencies on average, especially after the 1000 Hz marker, and the range of 1500 to 5000 Hz in particular increases. Also notably, the mesh panel sees a dip in noise levels for the frequencies in the range of 250 to 500 Hz or so. The same spikes mostly exist in the same places approximately, with the 230 Hz spike still there, but quieter, while the 450 to 500 Hz spike has shifted very slightly to the right on the frequency axis. We certainly believe that so-called acoustic glass, or laminated glass, which is actually what it is, can do something, but in this context, it seems like opportunistic marketing that retrofits itself into the actual purpose of the lamination, which is simply that the panel has to be made that way by the factory. It doesn't hurt, but the front of the case is mesh with a ton of holes in it, and the side panel doesn't really change that, and even if you put glass all around, maybe you can make a difference if there's glass everywhere, but we're just not seeing it here. All right, let's move on to thermals. For noise-normalized testing, we lower the speeds of all case fans until the total noise level measured at 1 meter in our hemi-anechoic chamber drops to 27 dBA SPL for normalized. This required very slightly different fan speeds for the X50 and the X50 Air, because the panels change. But that's exactly why we have this chamber and why it's so damn cool that we do have it, because here, the room level measurements, as in measuring outside of the chamber, would have had us at about the same noise level, which would slightly affect the thermal result. And as always, this chamber is basically sponsored by you all. Our audience has made purchases like these things possible by going to the store. So if you want to chip in for the next thing we buy, you can go to store.camerasnexus.net and grab a soldering and project mat, a mod mat for building your PC, tabletop gaming dice kit with e-waste inductors or Snowflake the cats, and more. All right, so adjusting for this very slight difference, the CPU thermals in the two cases are identical at 43 degrees Celsius above ambient for all core and 46 to 47 for the P cores. These results were gathered with the Antec Flux's stock fans installed. The BF360 had a strong showing in our recent review, and it's ahead of the X50 here with a significant lead from its 41 degree all core average. The once king Torrent is basically tied with the X50, as is the mesh-sided North XL. Appropriately, the Antec Flux is only a little warmer than the X50, using exactly the same fans at 44 degrees. It's tied with the glass-sided North XL here. Other than margin of error, the other differences would emerge from the case design. The Antec C8 with its bottom intake averages significantly worse for CPU thermals here at 50 degrees. In the same test, the X50 and X50 Air are more differentiated when considering GPU thermals. The X50 averages 44 degrees Celsius above ambient on the GPU, and the X50 Air averages 42, which is a relatively large gap for GPU thermal testing in our suite, especially for the same frame and fans. This makes sense since the mesh panel gives the GPU external access to air, and its exhaust from the top of the video card can also easily exit the side panel. The BF360's performance is strong on this test at 42.5 degrees, as is the C8 ARGB due to the bottom intake, but the X50 Air ties both for GPU thermals. The Torrent remains best on the chart with a 40 degree average, while the better of the two North XL results ties the X50 non-Air, and the Flux falls behind at 46 degrees. Moving to tests with the case fans at max speed, the best CPU temperature average was scored with the front bracket in the 0mm offset position, with a 36-degree all-core average and 39 on the P-cores. That's followed by the regular X50 at 37 degrees all-core, and then finally the X50 Air at 39 degrees all-core. For CPU thermals, it makes sense that the glass panel would help, as it ensures all intake makes it to the CPU and it's cooler, rather than having some of it escape out of the side of the panel prior to hitting the cooler. This is getting complicated, so we'll focus on the regular X50 for comparison here. The BF360 flow ended up at 40.5 degrees for P-core thermals when running at 44 or so dBA, with the X50 at the same noise level, so we're basically noise normalized again and tying it. The X50 Air falls behind here at 42.8 degrees, since we're losing CPU-bound air enough through the side panel, as in air that would have otherwise hit the CPU, if not for the mesh side. The Torrent's 42-degree average at 42.3 dBA is still respectable, but the flood of high airflow cases in recent years has pushed it down the chart, where it sits alongside the Antec Flux. The Flux being at 41.9 dBA and 42 degrees shows that its case kills more of the noise than a HYTE X50, which is about 3 dBA louder, and also the case fan positioning contributes here too. This is interesting since we're using the same fans here, so the X50 manages to get more air into the case, as seen by the thermals, but it is a little bit louder. The Antec C8's CPU thermals continue to be relatively weak, with a 46-degree all-core average, although that's accompanied by a relatively quiet 37.1 dBA noise reading. GPU thermals aren't significantly affected by the change in the side panel between the X50 and X50 Air for this test, with both averaging between 42 and 43 degrees above ambient for GPU temperature. This is a reversal of the behavior we saw in noise-normalized testing, so there's a value to considering both. With a 0mm offset on the front bracket, that average climbs to 44 degrees, so it's not an upgrade across the board. The stock BF360 flow averages 40 degrees, which beats the best of the X50 results. Overall, the BF360 has either tied or beaten the X50 in this test. This obviously depends on what fans are installed in the X50 and where, but we were fairly generous to the X50 by installing the 5 total fans from the Flux Non-Pro. As usual with cases that don't ship with any fans, our standardized fan testing methodology assumes a greater importance for this test. Of our standard set of 3 Noctua fans, we installed the 2 140s as front intake and 1 120 as rear exhaust, which comes close to the 3 intake by 1 exhaust config that HYTE considers optimal. With the 2 140mm fans positioned in the middle of the front panel, the X50 and X50 Air performed identically at 41 degrees all-core and about 44 degrees on the P-cores. Shifting the fans down to the lowest front slots in the X50 slightly lowered CPU temperatures. The BF360 non-flow comes without fans, so this test is perfect for comparing that variant against the X50. Using the same set of fans, the BF360 averaged 41 degrees all-core and 45 on the P-cores, which ties it with the X50 when the standardized fans are positioned in the middle, but the X50 pulls ahead a little with the lower fan placement. For context, when we performed this test in the BF360, the intake fans were positioned as low as possible in the front panel to point directly into the airflow scoop. Generally, this test indicates that the CPU cooling performance is equal between the BF360 and the X50 with our setup. Moving to GPU thermals with the standardized fans, the X50 and X50 Air with the front fans in the middle position again performed identically at 47 degrees above ambient, and the lower position was again better at 46 degrees. The BF360 had particularly good performance here, likely due to the airflow scoop, averaging 41 degrees above ambient. Combined with CPU cooling results, this puts the BF360 ahead of the X50 when using the same set of fans. Time to get into that Schlieren imaging we showed earlier. So this example shows the case without any side panel installed at all. You're just seeing the true chaos of air entering and exiting through a wide open side panel, where there's no particular direction of flow. Adding the glass panel has the expected effect. The only air density gradient we see now is from air exiting the back of the case and floating around near the mirror. There's not much movement here, as expected, because air can't penetrate glass. Swapping the panel to mesh instead, we see something pretty cool. The gradient change is most visible exactly where the GPU's exhaust is. It's spewing air out of the mesh from the GPU, allowing it to exit the case more easily. And you can also see it going pretty far away from the case, which is also a good thing. This has some benefits, but because the glass had provided a sort of railroaded path for intake to hit the CPU tower, it also has some downsides. We can also see, for example, towards the bottom that some air is exiting before ever hitting the GPU or the CPU tower, meaning that air is taken in from the front-bottom position and effectively lost without doing anything actually useful in this configuration. In this shot, you can see how the air, or specifically the air density gradient, although still chaotic on exit, takes a relatively straight path out of the louvered vents. The vents nearest the blade tip of the fan show this the most, where we can actually see how the air deflects around the vent punch-out. That's that white sort of tip is around the edge of that. This shot shows us the vents as well, where we get straight, clear paths, and gradient density changes prominently seen right at the vent tip once again. The air density differences show the air naturally finding itself going up, as we'd expect. Pretty cool to visualize this stuff, especially that mesh side panel and what it's doing. The HYTE X50 has overall good build quality, it has sturdy design elements structurally, and it has some pretty creative marketing. Sometimes that creative marketing produces things like this, which actually have function and not just marketing. This is one of the louvered vents, where it is technically stronger because they've retained all the metal that they've stamped through, and it does appear, at least in Schlieren imaging, to have an impact on the airflow characteristics out of the back of the case, which makes sense. So this one works. This is kind of cool. But it also has some creative marketing in the sense of this, the acoustic panels, which are just laminated glass panels. And that works for keeping the glass together if it were to shatter, if you put it on a tile floor and you end up in the graveyard of PC Master Race posters on Reddit who have an exploded glass panel, then it should help with that, at least keeping the glass together if it shatters. But acoustically, we simply were unable to produce a meaningful difference in real-world testing. Again, you might be able to force a difference to be shown with something like a synthetic noise generation device, but at that point you're kind of exiting the range a computer might reasonably make. And so we did not see a difference acoustically. It seems like a stupid thing to kind of burn marketing energy on at this point. They should just call it laminated glass and not talk about the acoustics. But again, the challenge to thermal testing came down to the fans. With the configurations we chose, it is pretty competitive. So against the Antec Flux directly, where the two use exactly the same fans, so they're the same setup, the HYTE X50 is generally better than the Antec Flux in pretty much every case, and sometimes significantly better. It just depends on the test. Now, to be very clear, there's an Antec Flux Pro model as well, and that one sorts out differently. That's got 6 fans. The performance is different. There's a lot of 140s in that one. So we are talking about the Flux non-Pro here. The standardized fan test was also overall favorable for the X50 when you just eliminate all the fans that cases include and use a standard set. As we mentioned in the BF360 review, Haven is HYTE's biggest competition for this particular release. The fanless BF360 costs $160, just like the HYTE X50 in the US. HYTE is well positioned though, because if you want a case that looks like the X50, there isn't any competition from anyone until GameMax or GameDS rip it off like they do everything else. The BF360 Flow wins in terms of thermals. It optionally comes with stock fans, and it has all the other benefits of build quality and ease of use that we mentioned in our review, but it's more conservative for design and only available in black and white. We like the X50 and we're comfortable adding it to our list of recommendations alongside the BF360. As usual, we have yet to see other manufacturers beat Lian Li's price to performance with the Landcool 217 at $120 and the 207 at $90, but that's not the market that HYTE, or actually Haven, are aiming for. If the colorful design of the X50 is more appealing than its thermal performance, the best alternatives we can give might be Thermaltake's Tower series, the Tower 600, the Series 350, the View 600, although we haven't reviewed those models. As for the rest of the market at the crowded $200 price point, factoring in the cost of fans, even with the higher US prices, the X50 compares favorably to established cases like the C8 Curve, the Torrent, the North XL, by combining high airflow with competent cable management and a quality of design that goes deeper than the outside of the case. As far as the Fractal North XL, it's not that the X50 is inherently better than it, but it can match performance in a way that makes it a valid alternative without sacrificing functionality, and both of them make it play at looks. That applies to the cases we brought up for comparison to the BF360 as well. Those would be the Meshify 3 Ambience Pro RGB, the Corsair Frame 5000D, and the Antec Flux Pro. The key factor is the way the X50 looks. The painful back and forth with HYTE's factories to get a working process for creating the curved front panels and louvered vents paid off. And it has put HYTE ahead of its rivals. So the glass lamination doesn't really matter unless you intend to smash your case or intend to test resonance through tile or something. We do think that the glass version of this, though, generally that's kind of the one we favor here. There's a couple reasons for that. First of all, the mesh side panel version, although this is the short one for the other side, but for the main side of the case, the mesh side panel is not equipped with anything to make use of the mesh side panel. So what's happening is whatever the fans in the computer itself are going to do. And that mostly means that the GPU, because most of them have vertically oriented fins that run this way when it's mounted normally, is going to blow the air out of this like we saw in our Schlieren imaging. And so that's a benefit in some situations where it can push the air out the side instead of kind of pushing it into the glass and then hoping it gets up and out efficiently and without heating too many other things. But there are scenarios where, like we saw with the glass panel in some testing, sometimes you get better performance with the glass installed rather than the mesh. It just depends on your configuration, but the reason that happens is because if you're pushing air in through the front, and especially if you're pushing air in through the side, if your main intake is the side of the case, like for a side-mounted liquid cooler, then you're going to lose some, or in that case, basically all of the air that's coming in because it's just going out the panel before it can ever hit the CPU tower. And so for that reason, we generally would default to the glass panel version because actually, despite it being glass, it will help kind of shape the channel of air into the case in a way that should mostly be beneficial. There are situations where mesh can be better, depends on your use case, but that's kind of how we stack them up. There's a lot of colors for the X50. That was pretty cool to see. Again, Thermaltake seems to be kind of the only other company that's competing at that level in the amount of colors available for a case model. And we can't think of many cases that have an offering of this kind of variety other than Thermaltake, Montech, maybe Geometric Future. We haven't really looked too much at their stuff, but we do look forward to HYTE expanding the X series lineup, hopefully in the same way it's done for the Y series, and hopefully with more sizes and design collaboration. So overall, it's a pretty good case. So that is it for this one. They're going to go frame that on a wall somewhere. You can subscribe for more as always. Go to store.gamersnexus.net if you want to help fund our incredibly high praise, such as it's a pretty good case, because I can tell you it is not often I say those words, but fortunately for the last couple we've reviewed, they have actually been pretty good. Otherwise, check out the Haven BF360 review on the channel. We'll link that below. And on the store, you can grab things like our mod mats, solder mats, our shirts, and other devices on the store if you want to support what we're doing and get something cool in return. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.